In 1965, the man who had just become the leader of a brand new country went on national television and broke down in tears. Not from joy, from fear. He had just been told his nation was finished, expelled from a larger federation, alone, landlocked on water, no army, no oil, no farms, no manufacturing base. A population of roughly 2 million people speaking 4 different languages, surrounded by neighbors who either resented them or ignored them. The Economist said it plainly. A city-state this small, this resource-poor, this exposed, couldn't survive. The geopoliticians agreed. Even Singapore's own founding leaders weren't sure they disagreed. That was 1965. Today, Singapore's GDP per capita surpasses the United States, the United Kingdom, and most of Western Europe. Its port is one of the most efficient on the planet. Its currency is among the most stable in the world. Its citizens live longer, earn more, and receive more education than people in countries 10 times its size. This didn't happen by luck. It didn't happen through natural resources. It happened because one small island made a set of decisions that almost every conventional economist said were wrong, and it turned out they were the only decisions that could possibly have worked. This is the story of how Singapore built one of the most powerful economies in human history from nothing. And more importantly, why the principles behind it still matter today. The island that wasn't supposed to exist. Before we understand what Singapore built, we have to understand what it started with. Geographically, it is a dot, roughly the size of a medium-sized American city. No rivers deep enough for serious agriculture. No minerals worth mining. Even its freshwater had to be imported from Malaysia through a pair of pipes that, at any moment, a hostile neighbor could simply shut off. For most of its history, Singapore existed not because of what it had, but because of where it sat. Positioned at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, it was the meeting point between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Every ship traveling between Europe, India, and East Asia had to pass through its waters. The British understood this immediately. When Stamford Raffles arrived in 1819 and claimed the island for the crown, he wasn't looking at the land. He was looking at the map. The port he built became one of the most active trading posts in the British Empire. Chinese, Indian, and Malay workers flooded in. Languages mixed. Cultures collided. Trade moved. But the British also built something more dangerous than a port, a deep dependency. Singapore's entire economy was structured around imperial trade. The moment the empire weakened, the island would have nothing left to fall back on. Then came February 1942. The Japanese military swept down the Malay Peninsula, not from the sea, where the British defenses were pointed, but through the jungle, by bicycle. Singapore fell in 8 days. Over 80,000 British soldiers surrendered. Winston Churchill called it the worst military disaster in British history. The message was received by every person watching. The empire's protection was an illusion. And an illusion can't be the foundation of an economy. After the Japanese occupation ended in 1945, the British returned. But the relationship had changed permanently. A movement for independence had already taken root. And in 1963, Singapore merged with the newly formed Malaysia, hoping that together they could build something stable. It lasted 2 years. The tension between Singapore's multiracial politics and Malaysia's Malay majority power structure became irreconcilable. Riots broke out. Political deals collapsed. And in August 1965, Singapore was not just granted independence. It was expelled. The architect of the impossible, the man who stood in front of cameras that day, red-eyed, exhausted, was Lee Kuan Yew. He was a Cambridge-trained lawyer, precise, unsentimental, and famously allergic to anything he considered wishful thinking. But what separated Lee from most leaders of newly independent nations wasn't his intelligence or his discipline. It was his willingness to look at his situation without illusion and to make decisions that his own ideology didn't always support. Most post-colonial leaders of the 1960s adopted some version of the same economic model: build walls, protect domestic industries, reject foreign capital, emphasize self-sufficiency. It was emotionally satisfying. After decades of colonial extraction, the instinct to push back was completely understandable. Lee watched what that approach produced. He looked at the outcomes, and he concluded quietly, without fanfare, that Singapore couldn't afford it. His logic was surgical. Singapore had no resources to protect. It had no domestic industry to shield. It had nothing to fall back on if it got the theory wrong. Which meant the only rational move was to make itself useful to the world in ways the world couldn't ignore. Not self-sufficiency, indispensability. This one shift from trying to survive independently to making itself structurally necessary to global trade became the organizing principle of everything Singapore built over the next 5 decades. The 4 problems that should have been unsolvable. When Lee Kuan Yew sat down to map out what Singapore actually needed to function, he arrived at a list of crises that would have paralyzed most governments. Each one individually would have been difficult. Together, they looked almost designed to be impossible. The water problem. Singapore had almost no natural freshwater supply. The island's reservoirs weren't enough. The rest came from pipes running north into Malaysia. The same Malaysia that had just expelled them. Any serious analysis of this situation produces one logical conclusion. Singapore was permanently exposed to the simplest act of economic hostage-taking imaginable. Lee's response wasn't to negotiate permanent water rights, though he did that too. His response was to treat water as a national security issue with the same seriousness you'd apply to military defense. The government built desalination plants when desalination was still considered commercially unviable. It invested in water recycling technology, eventually producing any water, a high-grade reclaimed water so clean it exceeded World Health Organization drinking standards. It built covered reservoirs across the entire island. It treated every square meter of surface area as potential catchment. Within a generation, Singapore had turned its most dangerous vulnerability into a model that countries with actual rivers now study. The housing problem. When Singapore became independent, roughly 1/3 of its population lived in informal settlements, overcrowded, unsanitary, at constant risk of fire, flood, and disease. The government launched the Housing Development Board, a public housing agency that operated on a scale almost unprecedented for a country of Singapore's size. But this wasn't just a construction program. Singapore didn't just give people homes. It made them affordable to own. Through a mandatory savings system, the Central Provident Fund, every worker contributed a portion of their income into a personal account. Those savings could be used to buy the very apartment the government had built. The result was extraordinary. People owned their homes, not technically through subsidies, but through accumulated savings they generated themselves. This meant they had a direct financial stake in the stability of the country. By the 1980s, over 80% of Singapore's population lived in government-built housing they legally owned. That is a number no country on earth has come close to replicating. The talent problem. A small island with limited land can only grow its economy through one mechanism: the quality of what its people produce. Lee made a decision that generated enormous cultural friction at the time. English would become the language of instruction in all schools. Not because of sentiment toward Britain, because English was the language of international business, science, law, and trade. Every Singaporean child would be functionally fluent in it while also maintaining their mother tongue. This wasn't assimilation. It was a calculated act of economic positioning. And alongside language, the government invested in education with a focus that bordered on obsession. Technical schools, universities, merit-based scholarship systems that pulled talent from every economic background. The logic was simple. If your only resource is people, then every person who fails to reach their potential is a direct economic loss. The defense problem. A small, wealthy, strategically located nation with no military is not a country, it's a prize. Singapore had virtually no armed forces in 1965. Lee brought in military advisors and built a defense force from scratch. Mandatory military service for every able-bodied male. Modern equipment. A doctrine based on deterrence. This wasn't aggression. It was the security layer, without which no foreign company would ever have trusted Singapore as a base for regional operations. You can't build the world's most business-friendly economy if you can't guarantee that tomorrow the city won't be occupied by someone else's army. The economic model that broke the rules. By the early 1970s, Singapore's infrastructure had stabilized. The basic existential crises were still present, but they were being managed. Now came the harder question. What would Singapore actually sell? In the 1960s, the dominant economic wisdom for developing nations was clear. Protect your industries, raise tariffs, build domestic champions. Keep foreign capital out until your own firms are strong enough to compete. This was the model followed across Latin America, Africa, South Asia, and much of Southeast Asia. In theory, it preserved economic sovereignty. In practice, it often produced protected industries that had no incentive to become efficient, because competition was the one thing they never faced. Singapore did the opposite. Lee's government looked at what Singapore could offer that no one else was offering quite as cleanly: a legal system based on English common law, reliable and predictable, a government with virtually no corruption, a bureaucracy that processed permits in days rather than years, low corporate tax rates, complete freedom to repatriate profits, a workforce that was increasingly educated and English-speaking, and a geographic position at the intersection of global trade routes. The pitch to foreign companies was essentially, you will be treated fairly here. The rules won't change on you tomorrow. Your money is safe, and your people can actually get things done. For multinational corporations navigating the regulatory chaos of most developing economies, this was genuinely radical. Companies came. First manufacturing, then financial services, then professional services, logistics, pharmaceuticals, aerospace maintenance. Singapore didn't just attract foreign investment. It made itself the platform through which the rest of Southeast Asia was accessed. The company that wanted regional headquarters in Asia almost inevitably considered Singapore first, because Singapore had made itself the most reliable environment in the region. This created a compounding dynamic. As more companies came, they trained local workers in sophisticated skills. Those workers built institutional expertise, or left, and started their own firms. The ecosystem deepened. The reasons to be in Singapore multiplied, which attracted more companies. This is what economists call agglomeration. Singapore deliberately engineered this dynamic at a time when most countries were trying to stop it. The corruption variable. There's a part of Singapore's story that doesn't fit comfortably into conventional economic frameworks. And it's the part that matters most for understanding why Singapore worked when so many similar attempts didn't. In 1952, before independence, Singapore established the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau. It was designed to investigate corruption in government and public service. When Lee Kuan Yew came to power, he gave that bureau genuine authority and genuine independence, not symbolic independence. Actual independence, including the power to investigate senior officials, ministers, and members of Lee's own party. Then he did something that most governments only talk about. He paid civil servants well. Not extravagantly, but competitively with what they could earn in the private sector. The theory was straightforward. If you want honest bureaucrats, you have to remove the financial desperation that makes corruption attractive. A civil servant earning a salary comparable to the private sector equivalent doesn't need bribes to survive. This isn't naive. It's arithmetic. The result was a public sector with a reputation for integrity that became, itself, a form of national infrastructure. Foreign companies didn't just come to Singapore because of low taxes. They came because they knew that when they submitted a permit application, it would be processed on its merits. When they signed a contract, the legal system would enforce it impartially. When they paid their taxes, the money would be used for the stated purposes. Trust is invisible on a balance sheet, but its absence destroys the conditions that every other economic advantage depends on. Singapore made trust a structural feature of its system, not as a value, as a competitive strategy. The price of the model: none of this came without costs that are worth being honest about. Singapore is not a liberal democracy in the Western tradition. It has never fully been one. Lee Kuan Yew's view of governance was explicit. Social order and economic development required discipline that Western-style political competition couldn't guarantee. Free press, unrestricted political opposition, the right to public protest in his framework, these were luxuries that came after prosperity, not preconditions for it. His People's Action Party won every election. For decades, that wasn't mainly because of rigging. It was because the government genuinely delivered. Housing, jobs, safety, infrastructure, education. But criticism of the government could be legally costly. Journalists who pushed too hard found themselves facing defamation suits. Opposition politicians sometimes faced legal challenges that conveniently disrupted their campaigns. Speech that was considered destabilizing was restricted. Western observers pointed to this as proof that Singapore's model was only possible through authoritarian control, that the economics couldn't be separated from the politics. Lee's answer was characteristically direct. Look at the countries that have political freedom and stagnant economies, and look at the countries that have order and growing ones. Then decide what you'd choose if your children were going hungry. This is not a comfortable argument. It is also not an argument that can be dismissed simply because it's uncomfortable. What it raises is a genuinely difficult question. Is Singapore's model replicable, or was it a specific combination of circumstances, leadership, and cultural context that produced outcomes that couldn't be engineered the same way anywhere else? The second reinvention. By the 1990s, something interesting was happening. The model that had worked so well in the 1970s and 80s was beginning to face a new kind of pressure. Manufacturing was shifting to lower-cost locations. China was opening. Vietnam was emerging. The labor cost advantage that had once made Singapore attractive for certain kinds of production was disappearing. Most countries in this position respond by trying to hold on, subsidizing industries that are no longer competitive, protecting jobs that are no longer viable, hoping the problem resolves itself. Singapore did what it had done in 1965. It looked at the situation without sentiment and asked, "What can we offer that others can't?" The answer this time was different. Not labor, not cheap manufacturing. Knowledge, capital, and connectivity. Singapore began repositioning itself as a financial hub, not just a regional one, but a global gateway between East and West. It built regulatory frameworks for banking and asset management that were both rigorous and internationally competitive. It developed its port technology so aggressively that today it consistently ranks among the most efficient in the world. It invested in biomedical research, pharmaceutical manufacturing, and the kind of high-value knowledge industries that require a sophisticated workforce and a reliable legal environment. It also kept its currency strong. deliberately maintaining a strong Singapore dollar as an anti-inflation tool, protecting purchasing power for a population that depended on imports for nearly everything. The bet was that attracting high-quality capital and high-value industries mattered more than making manufactured exports marginally cheaper. It worked. By the time the Asian financial crisis hit in 1997 and devastated the economies of Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and South Korea, Singapore absorbed the shock far better than any of its neighbors. The financial discipline it had maintained for 3 decades gave it a cushion that other countries, running looser monetary policies, simply didn't have. The numbers behind the myth. Let's talk about what Singapore actually built in concrete terms. In 1965, Singapore's GDP per capita was roughly equivalent to Mexico's. By 2023, it had surpassed the United States, one of the wealthiest large economies in human history. That is not normal. In economic terms, it is one of the fastest sustained improvements in living standards ever recorded for any country, anywhere. Its port handles over 37 million container units annually, making it consistently one of the 2 or 3 busiest ports in the world, despite the island being smaller than most major cities. Its Changi Airport has won the title of world's best airport more times than any other facility on Earth, a fact that matters not just symbolically but practically, since air connectivity is a major determinant of where financial services and corporate headquarters locate. Its education system produces students who consistently rank among the highest in international assessments in mathematics and science, not because Singaporean children are inherently more gifted, but because the system was designed from the beginning to take education seriously as an economic asset. The Sovereign Wealth Fund Singapore, established Temasek manages assets exceeding $300 billion, generated largely from the proceeds of state-owned enterprises that the government built, professionalized, and in many cases eventually privatized. Its healthcare system delivers outcomes comparable to the best systems in the world at costs significantly lower than most developed countries, not through rationing, but through a combination of personal savings accounts, insurance, and targeted subsidies that created incentives for both efficiency and access. None of these outcomes were inevitable. Every one of them was designed. What the rest of the world actually learned. Here's where it gets interesting and where most coverage of Singapore stops too early. The question people always ask is, can Singapore's model be copied? The honest answer is, partially. No other country shares Singapore's exact geographic position, its specific historical circumstances, its particular cultural composition, or the particular combination of luck and leadership that produced Lee Kuan Yew at the exact moment he was needed. Trying to replicate Singapore wholesale is like trying to replicate a masterwork by copying the frame. You can copy the surface. You can't import the conditions. But the principles underneath the surface, those are universally applicable, and they are, largely, universally ignored. The principle that honest government is an economic asset, not a moral luxury. The principle that investing in human capital produces returns that dwarf almost any other form of public spending. The principle that long-term planning horizons produce outcomes that quarterly thinking destroys. The principle that geographic or resource disadvantages can be converted into competitive differentiation if you're willing to think carefully about what you actually have to offer. The principle that trust between citizens and institutions, between business and government, between a nation and the global economy, is infrastructure that takes decades to build and can be destroyed in months. These aren't Singapore-specific insights. They're observations about how economies actually work that Singapore chose to act on when most other countries chose to ignore them. That gap between knowing something and actually organizing a society around it is the real story, the unresolved questions. Singapore today faces pressures its founders didn't have to solve. an aging population and birth rates among the lowest in the world, housing costs that have risen far faster than wages for younger generations. Questions about whether a system built on meritocratic discipline is capable of the flexibility and innovation that the next phase of the global economy may require. The political model that worked brilliantly for building infrastructure and attracting capital is being tested by a population that is wealthier, more educated, and more globally connected than any generation before it, and which has expectations about political participation that don't fit neatly into the framework Lee designed. Singapore's leaders are aware of all of this. They have, historically, been aware of problems before most governments acknowledge they exist. Whether that awareness is sufficient to navigate what comes next is a genuinely open question. What is not open is the question of what Singapore already built. A country that should not have survived its first decade is today one of the wealthiest, best governed, and most strategically important economies on Earth. The man who wept on camera in 1965 because he believed his nation was doomed, he lived to see it surpass the colonial power that once governed it. Some things that should be impossible turn out, under the right conditions and with the right decisions, to be merely very difficult. Singapore is what it looks like when a country refuses to accept the difference. In 1965, Singapore had nothing. Not nothing as a figure of speech, nothing as a factual description. No resources, no army, no allies, no safety net. Just a location, a small population, and a leader who decided that the only acceptable response to impossible circumstances was to think more carefully than anyone else about what was actually possible. The result is a country that, by almost every measurable standard, outperforms what its starting conditions should have allowed. The question worth sitting with isn't whether Singapore's exact path can be copied. It's why so many countries with far more advantages have produced so much less. That gap is worth thinking about for a while.